What is the kingdom of heaven like? This is a question that Jesus is wrestling with and asking, talking about in the text that we're going to look at today. We're going to read eventually from Matthew chapter 13, and Jesus is telling a series of parables. We're going to read one of them, and it's only going to be 2 verses worth of parable, so be ready to stand up and sit down quick, much different than the Revelation series we had a few months ago. But when I read parables of Jesus, a lot of times there is this sort of sense that they're tied to a different world than we live in, an agrarian culture 2,000 years ago. So I thought I would tell 2 parables from our world today that I think sort of smell a little bit like the parable that Jesus is going to tell us when we read the scripture today. One comes from culture and one comes from my own personal experience. So here you go. Here are the parables of Tim about the kingdom of heaven. The first is from the show The Office. I love The Office. And in fact, you may recall that last year we did a Christmas coffee house video based on The Office, as if the church office was The Office. We're doing another one tonight, so come and see that. It should be pretty good. Now, in the 3rd season of The Office, Jim, one of the main characters, runs from his branch to Stamford, Connecticut, because he's in love with someone he works with and she's engaged. And so when he goes to Stamford and gets a new job in the same company in a different office, there's a guy who works in front of him, the next desk over, named Andy. And Andy's kind of a gregarious personality, kind of a weirdo at the same time. And Andy, on the first day, notices that Jim has brought with him a tuna sandwich for lunch. Real big stuff, right? Who would think that making a tuna sandwich is that big of a deal? But Andy decides, because he brought a tuna sandwich, he's going to call him the Big Tuna from now on. And so for the rest of the series, Andy will make reference to Jim being the Big Tuna, just because for one day he brought a tuna sandwich with him. All right, that's parable number 1. Parable number 2 is a story from my time in 1st grade. I had a 1st grade teacher assigned to me with what I think is the literal worst name that any 1st grade teacher could possibly have. Her name was Miss Farty. And you may think that I'm making that up because it's so absurd, but it was literally spelled F-A-R-D. Why? Farty. But you can't pronounce it without sounding like you're talking about passing gas. Miss Farty, 1st grade teacher. And everyone in kindergarten knew about Miss Farty. And the story was that if you get Miss Farty, you do not want to sit in the front row. And now here's the thing, I don't remember her ever passing gas. I'm sure with a name like that, she was very sure that she was never going to pass gas in public. However, every time, all year long, whenever she would say, all right, we're going to redo where we sit in class today, everyone in the class would hope that they would not end up in the front row of Miss Farty's class. Now, that's a whole lot of narrative and story to get hung on you just because of your last name. Sometimes little, tiny details can become much bigger than they actually are and tell a larger story than it actually is. What is the kingdom of heaven like? Well, you might have some ideas in your own mind. You might listen to hard rock music and you might think to yourself of a Stairway to Heaven. You may love Led Zeppelin and you think, oh, right, Stairway to Heaven, that's what I think of when I think of what heaven is like. You might think of a garden paradise, a beautiful remaking of the Garden of Eden, as the end of Revelation tells. You might think of a royal city, a beautiful structure that one day all of God's people will live in. And there's reason for all of these images and imaginations. They're all big pictures. They're all exciting destinations. But when Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven, so often he's talking about something so much smaller, to the point that honestly, it could be a bit confusing. And you can wonder, what in the world is he talking about? Today, he's talking about the kingdom of heaven, and he's talking about one of the smallest things you could possibly imagine. When Jesus tells this parable, he is not talking about a city or a garden. He's talking about something that you could barely pinch between your two fingers. And he says that this is what the kingdom of heaven is like. And so we're going to read those two verses, Matthew chapter 13, 31 to 32. You better get your stretch in during the first verse because this is going to go fast. So would you stand with me? Matthew chapter 13, verses 31 to 32. He being Jesus, told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds come and perch on its branches. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. So a mustard seed, you plant it, it becomes huge. There are multiple different kinds of trees that come from different strands. This is a mustard tree that could come from a strand, a small, tiny, little mustard seed. I have mustard seeds in my office that I keep. They're expired now. But I almost brought them down as a lesson, but I literally thought they were so small, there's no point. Like, there's no chance that you could see them if you were any further than the second row or so. You pinch like this to hold it, it's so small. And the possible yield and result is a tree as large as this on your screen. I've got two more pictures of trees as well that come from mustard seeds, different type. This is another tree that comes from a mustard seed. And then finally, there's another one that's more from the Middle East, probably most similar to what Jesus was talking about. It looks like it's just a giant bush that grows out more than it does up. But even in this, you see it's 2 to 3 times the height of the man, and there remains branches in which birds can perch themselves in. And these plants, trees, bushes, come from a seed so small that you could not see it as close as you are to me. This picture here is an idea of what a mustard tree might look like, and you see the fingers pinching the mustard seed. The size of this seed is imperceptibly, almost ridiculously small. And Jesus is saying this small seed turns into something giant, and that's what the kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of heaven is like the mustard seed that becomes so big birds can perch on it. Well, honestly, that's not a fully developed theology of heaven, is it? What's Jesus getting at here? Well, he actually teaches a series of 6 parables in chapter 13, all of which are about the kingdom of heaven, or what the kingdom of heaven is like. There's the parable of the sower, which is a fairly familiar parable where there's a gardener who's just taking seed and throwing it indiscriminately everywhere. And Jesus explains to us that what matters when seed is just thrown around is what kind of ground you are. That fertile ground yields a huge crop, but thorny ground will choke out the seeds, and hard ground won't allow the seed to penetrate. And it begins to talk about the spiritual condition of our heart and our life, and how we might be different kinds of ground, and that we want to be fertile ground where the Word of God will take life and root and grow. There's the parable of the wheat and the weeds, which basically is about a field that's ready to be sown, and a farmer who goes and sows seeds perfectly so that it'll grow, but an enemy comes and puts in weeds into the ground overnight. And the farmer has a problem that he can't just weed the ground because he'll take up the good wheat as well. And so Jesus is saying the kingdom of heaven is like this ground where both the wheat and the weeds have to grow together, and you have to let them both thrive. And at the very end, it'll come through and you'll separate the wheat from the weeds. And the wheat will go into the barn, and the weeds will go into a fire because they're useless and they need to be destroyed. The kingdom of heaven is like that. Interesting parable to think about how Sometimes we want the world around us to function in holy ways, but Jesus is almost warning us to say, hey, there's going to be struggle, and there's going to be things taking your time and resource and energy around you. You've got to learn to grow and thrive even in that, and the kingdom will sort you as the wheat that you are. You've got to be patient in the midst of this chaos that you live in. The next one is the parable of the mustard seed that we just read, which goes on then to the parable of the yeast. Another interesting parable about how you take a lump of flour and you take a little bit of yeast and you work it into the flour. And it's the yeast that is really the agent that brings change, but you've got to knead it all the way through the flour. Flour is nearly useless until it becomes activated by yeast. And the kingdom of heaven is like the yeast that's working its way all the way through the dough. Interesting. A parable of the hidden treasure. Jesus talks about how if you were to go out onto a field and find a treasure that was worth way more than anything you've ever had, you might go and mortgage everything, sell everything, and purchase that field because you recognize the value in what you have found, the treasure you found in this field. You would sell everything. You would give it all up in order to focus on having this field. The final one, the parable of the net. The kingdom of heaven is like a net that you throw over as a fisherman into the water, and you pull up whatever you can pull up. You don't discriminate while the net is down. You pull it up, you put it in the boat, you go back to the shore, and you sort through what is waste and what is fish that you can eat. And you throw the waste away and you keep the fish. The kingdom of heaven is like this, Jesus says. Each and every one of these parables are fascinating parables. And they're some ways easy for us to understand. And in some ways, they're from a time and a place and a world and an economy and a life. It's very different than the way we live. And so sometimes it's easy to understand what Jesus is talking about, and sometimes we have to strain our mental capacity a little bit. How is that like the kingdom of heaven? Well, this is chapter 13, but I quickly want to show you the context in which Jesus is preaching this sermon, if I could. It's fascinating to see what's happening on either side of this succession of 6 parables that Jesus teaches. At the end of chapter 12, we have Jesus in conflict with his family. His mother and his brothers are coming to him and are basically saying, dude, you're embarrassing us. Shut up and come home. And Jesus looks around the people listening to him, and he says, fairly famous quote of Jesus, whoever does the will of the Father is my brother and my sister and my mother. Now, for those of us who are interested in the will of the Father, this is good news, but can you imagine how Mary heard that? I mean, I know how my mom would have heard that. Son, I birthed you. I brought you into this world. I could take you out of this world. Keep talking like that, right? That's how mothers think. That's how mothers talk. This would have been deeply insulting to an already insulted family. And then after he teaches the parables, we find out that Jesus is in conflict with his hometown as well, not just his family, but the people who knew him as a child as well. And Jesus says at the end, after these parables, a prophet is not without honor except in his own town and his own home. And he did not do many miracles there in Nazareth because of their lack of faith. And so Jesus is teaching these parables in context of him having struggles with his home, his family, and where he is from. And Jesus chooses to teach in this way of parable, which is a strange way of teaching because, again, it's not always clear what a parable is talking about. You almost need to adjust the ears that you're listening with to get to the bottom of what a parable is about. And for those of us who may say, well, 2,000 years on, I really do understand the parables. Often we understand the parables because the idiot disciples did us a favor, pulled Jesus aside and asked him to explain what's going on here. And so we've got box seats to hear the explanation to the disciples so that we can get to the bottom of what in the world Jesus is talking about. The way in which we interact with parables is really important because it's Jesus' most regular form of teaching, and it's often in a world that we don't fully grasp or understand. And so I brought a quote with me from a man named Ulrich Lutz, a New Testament scholar, who said this about parables. I think it's helpful. He says, the significance of the parables points again and again to everyday life, normal, everyday, mundane things. And the parables ask to be lived, not to be grasped by the intellect. And let me explain what I think that means from my perspective. We are all Western people reading an Eastern text. For us, as Westerners, we have been taught and informed from very, very early years to learn to believe something, to understand something, to grasp something. We're taught that when our brain can get itself around it, then our behavior will follow. That's generally how we're taught. Once you believe something, then you will do that something. Easterners tend to be taught the opposite of that. Once you have a gut reaction or gut feeling or an emotional attachment to something, then you'll try it out to see if it's true. It's a little bit of a different way of thinking and moving towards belief. So parables work really well in Eastern cultures because it's an invitation to the gut and to the heart to try something out, to test it, to see if it's true. Whereas we, on the other hand, want to have our mind convinced, and once our mind can be convinced by rationality, by argument, by fighting, then we'll say, okay, that might be true. All right, well, I will change how I live because my brain has decided that that must be more true than what I believed before. The parables aren't speaking to your brain, because if you just come at the parables with your brain, you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. That's not a complete thought. You can't just do that. The parables are inviting our heart and our gut to feel. It's doing more evoking than explaining, if you will. And when the parables evoke something out of us, the invitation is to try it out, to live it, to see if it works. And if it works, the invitation then is to come to believe what it is that Jesus is teaching. And so in the context of what Jesus is teaching, this becomes a moderately troubling text that we've read today. Because we have a sense of order and safety and security. Often our sense of order, the way we understand our life, starts with family, nation, what we belong to, the institutions we're a part of, and we begin to understand and orient our identity around those sort of things. And here in this text, if we see it in full context, these sort of things, which these are good things. Like, I love being an American. I love my family. I love where I came from. I understand myself still much to many of your anger, so as a Bostonian, because that's where I'm from. Like, my identity is rooted in rooting for the Red Sox and the Patriots and blah, blah, blah. I know it's terrible, right? But that's where I'm from. It's like this is my connection to my people, where I'm from. These are all things that tell the story of who I am. And if you start undoing those things, it's really hard for me to articulate who I am. I'm a Brooks. My dad was in the military. I'm from New England. These are the organizing principles of who I am. This is what creates safety and security for me. And you could name these things in your own life as well. It's where your belonging and identity comes from. And those things, the things that are the equivalents to Jesus' life, to some degree, are crumbling in this text. His mom is mad at him. His town isn't accepting him. The people that knew him when he was a child, the people who changed his diapers, who taught him in first grade, the people who were the coaches of his basketball team, are all kind of questioning who he is and what he's up to. His organizing principles are crumbling, and he's teaching in parables in these moments. And one of the reasons it seems as though Jesus' family and hometown are questioning him is because, if I can borrow the parable that we've read, they knew him when he was just a little mustard seed. And now he's a tree. And they want him to be a mustard seed because that's the child that they knew. He's just Joseph's boy. He made my kitchen table. I babysat him. This is who Jesus is. He's a mustard seed. He's one of us. He's from a nothing town, a backwards place. He has a job, a career, a family, a people. He's just a mustard seed. And now look, he comes into town with crowds and people wanting to listen to him. And they think he has authority. Who does he think he is? He's one of us, not one of them. Jesus is becoming a mustard tree, if you borrow the parable. He's not who he was in the minds of the local people. The kingdom has taken root in his life, the call to be the Messiah, to tell the people of Israel about freedom and the good news of God's forgiveness and kingdom and his justice. And Jesus is embodying that and growing in stature in front of their eyes. And the people who knew him back when prefer him as a mustard seed to the tree that God is making him out to be. Now, this is the one way the people who knew him as a child are seeing him. Imagine what Rome thinks at this point. We know that Jesus is on a collision course to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the teachers of the law in Rome will conspire together to put him on the cross. Imagine what Rome thinks when they're getting reports from soldiers and centurions, governors, that this nation of Israel, which is a failed nation defeated by Rome, is not just falling in line like every other nation that Rome defeats. Instead, there's this guy walking around in this failed nation, gathering crowds, talking about the kingdom of heaven, and everywhere he goes, more and more crowds come. Why won't this guy shut up? And why won't those people of Israel stop having dreams and fantasies of grandeur when they're a nation that keeps losing war after war, and we have put them in their place, and everyone else around will just listen to us? Imagine what Rome thinks as Jesus is becoming more and more of a strong tree, where people who are desperate for a word of good news are perching on his branches and sitting under his shade. The world works in a certain way. And when the kingdom of heaven breaks in and starts changing the patterns and the stories, people start getting really mad. So this parable of the mustard seed, 2 verses about a tiny little seed that when it's planted well turns into a giant tree. It invites us to understand, but also, more specifically, it invites us to test if Jesus' words are true. Can we transform from a small, insignificant mustard seed to a strong branch and tree where God uses us as strength in this world? Can small acts of faithfulness out of our own life transform us into something powerful? Can small acts of faithfulness grow something huge out of our life? And what about if we feel small? Not just do we do small acts of faithfulness, but do we ever feel small like a mustard seed? This text can be transformative to us if we feel as insignificant and powerless and small as a mustard seed. We may think we've tried lots of things. We may think that no one notices, no one cares, no one appreciates who we are. We may feel as small and as insignificant as a mustard seed, like in this picture when you pinch it in between. We may feel like nothing good seems to be emerging out of our life. That we wish we could be more, but it seems like we hardly matter. If that's the case, Jesus invites us to see that humble beginnings yield large crops if we invest them in the kingdom of God. That we may feel insignificant like a mustard seed, but when God works in and through us, we can become a tree that's mighty and powerful, where we can give shade to people who are hurting and branches for people to perch on. We may feel small now, but God can make something significant and strong and mighty and wonderful out of it. But more than anything, Jesus teaching this parable in the middle of his own tension and his life systems beginning to crumble on his way to the cross, he teaches us that the kingdom of God is growing, and that it's growing large through surprisingly small or seemingly insignificant origins. God is up to something big. And sometimes we interpret things to be insignificant or small, pointless, unheard, unusable, undesirable, we can cast things off to the side. And here Jesus invites us to say, what if that's just a mustard seed? It looks like it can't do anything. It looks like it's got no potential, no value. But yet it can become the biggest tree in the forest. The kingdom of heaven invites us to see that Jesus is teaching us that in our small acts of faithfulness and our seeming and feeling insignificant, God can use us to make something large, something exciting, something powerful in this world. We, if we can turn ourselves over to God, can become a giant tree that the kingdom just grows and flourishes in and through our life. We've learned this month as we've been working through Advent, that Advent before Christmas is a reminding of what God has already done and then what is not yet. And as Jesus teaches these parables about what the kingdom of heaven is like, we can look and see that God's reign and rule has begun in Jesus. The King has come. We have met him in scriptures. We met him in worship. The King sits on the throne. God's reign has started. But it's not done yet. It's not finished. There's still mustard seeds in fertile ground that need to grow. We've experienced the already of Jesus coming, being birthed, resurrecting, becoming king. But we await a heaven that is not fully developed in our world yet. We can have a foretaste of heaven in Jesus, but heaven in its fullness, well, this ain't it. But it's coming. And no matter how big or how small we feel as we walk into the worship today, God is reminding us that something big and mighty can grow out of us, because that's how the kingdom works. The kingdom takes things and seeds and people that feel small and insignificant and does something mighty and powerful through people like us. So as we await God's fullness, let's not forget about the mustard seed, and let's be willing to be a mustard seed and say, God, build something out of me. Plant me where you need to plant me, and may I grow into something mighty for the sake of the kingdom. The band is going to come out and sing a final song about heaven, a reminder of heaven. And it's a reminder of the not yet part. But take what is already of your life and bring it to this song and hear the imagination of what's not yet, what is to come, and to say, what can my life be between these two poles? I know of Jesus. I long for the kingdom. What does it mean for me in between? And God, what might you grow out of me, where I am, who I am now? Make something mighty, that people who long for shade can find it in my life. And people who long for a break and a perch where they can sit can do so by what you've grown out of my life. Would you stand with me as we sing this final song?